With the substrate for the top of the desk made, it's time to start cutting veneer. I'm going to cut the veneer for the bottom first, most of which you actually won't see, but when veneering, it's always best to veneer both sides of a substrate, and of course there are places you will see on the bottom, so we need to have veneer there. I'm using walnut, and on the bottom we're just going to use straight lengths of walnut down the length of the top. Now, because this walnut is so long, it's somewhat difficult for me to cut the edges so that they match up perfectly. But we want to get as good as we can. So what I've done is I've taken 6 leaves of veneer and I've overlapped them slightly on my table here, taped down, and then I drew a straight edge, or excuse me, I snapped a line along the length so that I could get a straight edge. And now I'm just taking a straight piece of plywood to use as a guide, and I'm going to cut through all 6 sheets at the point at which they overlap, and the idea being then that these adjacent sheets will fit together fairly nicely. And I'll do the same thing then on the opposite edges, and then we'll be ready to tape this together and we'll get a pretty good sheet. I'm using a veneer saw, which is more like a bunch of little tiny knives on a saw blade, and we simply, I like to pull the saw and cut through all the layers of veneer. And I can hear when I'm all the way through and I'm down to the MDF, and then I'll go in and I'll move on, cut through all of them at the same time when the straight edge is on there, so that you don't shift the straight edge and have to go back later and try to figure out where was that straight edge. The underside panel of walnut veneer is taped up now using veneer tape, and now what I'm going to do is prepare the substrate to glue this on today. Okay, here's the substrate for the top. The underside is up right now. When I made this lamination, it bowed slightly. So to try to counteract that bow somewhat, what I've done is it had bowed up in the center here. So to counteract that, I've put some shims under each end and then run a couple of screws into the floor to bring the center down just slightly, and then when I glue on the bottom panel of veneer, hopefully it'll have a little tendency to come under tension when I release the screws and help straighten the piece a little bit. To get the tooth I need for the glue, I'm going to go ahead and rough up the surface of this medium density fiberboard with a little 120 grit sandpaper, and that will help the glue bond a little better. This veneer job is a big job. It's 82-inch long substrate by 45.5 inches wide, and it presents a challenge. I could not use the conventional vacuum bagging technique by myself in a one-man shop, because the substrate is just too heavy and hard for me to maneuver into the bag, keeping the veneer properly placed on the substrate. I can't afford any shifting of the veneers as I'm trying to put this into the bag. So I had to rule out that method, which rules out certain adhesives. I could not use a typical, say, Unibond 800 adhesive, which requires pressing if you're in a vacuum bag. The other challenge is that most adhesives have water in them, hide glue, PVA glues, and so forth, and water, would absorb into the veneer and cause it to stretch some. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to deal with that. So what I've selected is a water-based glue that's, this is proprietarily called Heat Lock, but other PVA type glues will work to some extent this way as well. This is an iron-on glue. What you do is you apply the glue to the back of the veneer, you apply it to the substrate, you let it skin over, not completely dry, but you want most of the water to be driven off, but you want the glue to still be soft enough that when you come and put a clothes iron on the veneer, it will heat up the glue, reactivate it, and you'll get a bond. I'll also come back with a little pressure using a veneer hammer, which is not really a hammer. What it is it's a blade rounded over that you can then put pressure on and really concentrate pressure as you slide this across the veneer and help the bond get better. And so what I'll do is I'll apply the adhesive to the entire piece of veneer, then I'll go and apply it to the entire substrate, let it dry for 20 minutes or so, then go ahead and put this on top of the substrate, and then starting from the middle and working out to the ends, I will iron and press with a veneer hammer until I'm completely done, and that will give me a good bond. It'll also give me control of the joints. If the veneer tries to sort of overlap itself at the joints, which sometimes happen, I'll be able to handle that on a case-by-case basis, and we think we'll get a good result. By the way, this particular adhesive I get from veneersupplies.com, which is Joe Woodworker. I talked about him, I think, when I was talking about the press, the vacuum bag press, and I'm using just a foam roller to apply this. Okay, I've got the veneer reasonably centered and even on the substrate, and of course I allowed the adhesive to dry so that it was just the slightest tack. Now I've got my iron set to a medium-high heat. It's actually a little bit above wool for this particular iron. I want to make sure I'm getting enough heat to get through and activate the glue, and the plan is to move in this direction. The first time you put the iron down is the most important, because that locks in your veneer to the position. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. That veneer is down there now. I'll go ahead and I'll work myself across the sheet, anchoring the veneer. Veneer will have a slight tendency to change shape as you do this, so you've got to be aware of that. Be careful for that. It actually tends to shrink a little bit, which you can use to your advantage. You want to set the iron hot enough to activate the glue, but not hot enough to burn the veneer. That's really all you're worried about. Particular veneering hammer that I'm using, I was fortunate enough to win at auction at a Furniture Society conference. It was made by Paul Henry, and it's very nice. By the way, if you're not a member of the Furniture Society, you should join. www.FurnitureSociety.org. We're having a conference coming up in June of 2012. Of course, if you're watching this video after June 2012, then we'll have a conference the following June. We try to do it every June. And at those conferences, you'll be able to take classes, or I shouldn't say classes, but presentations, demonstrations by world-famous furniture makers, and then you'll be able to go and have lunch and dinner with them and other people like me who aren't world-famous. And it's just a great learning experience. This year it's going to be held in Portland, Maine at the Maine College of Art, June 14 through 16, I think. But go to www.FurnitureSociety.org and sign up. Become a member. You won't regret it. Okay, this heat bonding method is also great for edge banding. It's really what it was designed for in the beginning, but it seems to be working for this application. We've got a good bond through here. I'll just go ahead and work myself all the way across. Okay, the veneer is in place now. I got a little exuberant with the hammer and ran off the edges some, but fortunately it broke cleanly on the edge. I'm going to let this sit for several hours. Let the glue really cure. Then I'll go ahead and take off the tape and trim the edges, and then we'll be ready to release it, turn it over, and start veneering the other side, the show side. Now I've cut off the major excess of the veneer just using a pair of scissors, but now I'm trying to trim the veneer fairly close to the substrate, and then I'll come back with a block of sandpaper and actually smooth it perfectly flat with the edge of the substrate. I'm using a fine multi-master to do this cutoff. You could do it with a veneer saw. I just happen to have this tool. It makes it easy to control, and I'm just trying to cut fairly close, with about 1/8 of an inch or so, maybe a little closer to the substrate. cutting off this edge of the veneer is to not chip out any large chunks. So you don't want to use any tool that's going to really pull at the veneer and cause it to chip out. This particular multi-master vibrates back and forth about a zillion times a second, and it's similar to a veneer saw in the way the teeth are very small and sharp. So that's works good for that purpose. But anyway, you got to be careful you don't pull out big chunks of veneer. So I've got the veneer cut fairly close. Now I'm going to go ahead and take just a plywood block. I put some pressure sensitive adhesive P120 sandpaper on here, and I'm just going to use this like a shooting board. Just to sand off that little edge. So I'm nice and flush. And now I'm removing the tape from the glued down veneer. You can sand it off. My preference many times is just to wet a little paper towel and just get the paper itself saturated, the tape. And if you do this for a couple of minutes, I wet this down a little earlier, so it doesn't really soak in this fast. But you can just let it soak in for 5 minutes or so, re-wet it again, and then just peel it up in one piece. And that way when I'm sanding, I can be paying attention to the wood instead of the tape, making sure that I don't accidentally sand through the thin veneer.